So today we are joined by Dr. Jonathan Murakami. Jonathan, did I say that right?
Yes, you did, Madeline. Thank you.
I like to pronounce people's names correctly. So I'm Maddie Anthes. I'm with the Center for Student Success, and Dr. Jonathan Murakami is from Mental Health Services. He and I did a presentation last semester on procrastination and how that affects your mental health and academic performance. But after we talked to a lot of students and just from anecdotal things, I know there's also this added increase of anxiety, especially during these pandemic times. So I asked Dr. Murakami if he would help with expanding a new presentation for similar to what we did last semester, but also talking about procrastination. So the way that this is going to work is I will hand over the microphone to Dr. Murakami. I will be cueing the slides. I'm going to put a sign-in sheet in the chat soon. If you're earning credit for this, then want to make sure that you're getting that. At the end, there will also be a feedback sheet as well. When Dr. Murakami is finished, I'm going to give a quick presentation on just some academic skills and some tips that will help you as you go through the semester. And at the end, we'll have some time for question and answer. Typically what we do, this is a webinar format. Excuse me, you can raise your hand on the chat function and I can call on you to speak, or you can put something in the Q&A or the chat as well. So I will mute myself and take off my camera so that you can really focus on what's going on. But Jonathan, I will listen for your cues.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Maddie.
You.
So everyone, I even felt like today's little exercise in needing to be flexible is actually a good example of how we can manage our anxiety around even our work. Part of what anxiety is about identifying future threats. And for a lot of us, what that can turn into is that when we run into obstacles that we either anticipated or didn't anticipate, and we felt anxious about running into them in the first place, sometimes that leads people to panic and freeze and not know what to do, or even leave the assignment. And in fact, what's often so helpful to pushing through that is a certain degree of flexibility and learning to just work with the situation, figure out what questions you have, how can you do something differently, and how can you transform it into something else that might be a little bit more workable, similar to what we had to do today even. So if we could go to the next slide. So how does anxiety tend to affect procrastination? Well, some of the research seems to indicate, especially for people who chronically procrastinate, is that a big part of the reason why someone might procrastinate is that they just have difficulty managing some of the negative moods and emotions that come up around a task, especially anxiety. Next slide, please. And before we get into that, I'd like to start off by talking about what is the function of anxiety. And the reason why I even start with this question is because for a lot of students, they're familiar with how it affects their body, even how it makes them think or even behave, but they might not be sure why is it actually important to human growth and development, especially if it feels like something that's so difficult and toxic as an experience. Well, the function of anxiety is this, and I'd like to actually use the definition of fear to explain it. Fear and anxiety share a lot of the same symptoms, but fear tends to be a response to an immediate danger, something in your environment that could actually really threaten you. An example of this for a lot of students in terms of academics is sometimes they have a fear response as soon as they sit down and open the book and realize they have to do 40 pages of reading and all the fonts is really tiny and there isn't even any pictures to break up the space. That can bring up a lot of fear. But for some people with anxiety, anxiety can come into this experience when it starts to affect how you think about the future and what's going to happen afterwards. So to build off this example, some people might sit down to an exam and feel a level of fear about the experience itself. But then they might start to think about the road ahead and start to think about failing, maybe failing the exam, failing the course, failing the semester. And suddenly they start to find themselves getting more anxious in that moment because they get overly preoccupied with thinking about what might what potential threat might happen down the road. And that is the core function of anxiety. It helps us identify potential threats that could happen. And the helpful thing about that is it's supposed to help us plan for the now. If we can identify problems that are going to happen in the future, then one thing we can do to manage that is actually plan for the now. But this can become a problem over time. Next slide, please. Or this can be a problem for some people. Um, Academics can be anxiety provoking for a number of different reasons. There's actually a lot of different threats that can come up when people face their academic work. So for example, when you sit down to like an article you have to read, a problem set you have to go through, even studying for an exam, it might not just be about doing the work itself. For some people, they sit down and start to do that work, and then they start to think about how they might fail or how they might not meet their personal or other people's expectations, or they even might be uncertain about how to proceed and don't know what to do next. Anxiety about all these things can also bring up additional emotional reactions. For example, some people start to feel hopelessness around like being able to do the work. Some people get overwhelmed when they think about the fear of failing or not meeting personal or others' expectations. Some people experience a lot of shame about having so much difficulty with the experience. And a lot of students even report just feeling really frustrated with needing to do the work itself. Next slide, please. And when tasks that are perceived as anxiety provoking, they can bring up a number of different psychological and physical symptoms that can be difficult to navigate and handle in the moment. For example, some people will sit down work, and if they sit down to do some work, and if they feel really anxious about how this is going to play out, they might start like talking really negatively about themselves. They might start to make comments like, oh, I'm just too stupid for this, or I can't do this, or I'm just going to fail again. Or they might even start thinking negatively about the future and have thoughts like, I'm never going to be able to do this. I'm going to end up failing out of college. I'm just going to have to like work some job that I will barely scrape by in. And they even like get way so far ahead where I've had students talk about how they're going to be when they're 40 years old, when they're sitting and talking to me as an 18-year-old student. Anxiety is not only affecting your thoughts, but it also affects our bodies. It makes us feel a number of physical symptoms or experiences in the present that can be really difficult. And for some people, it even brings up negative past memories that might be triggered by the experience of studying or by a particular course or by a particular task. For example, sitting down to do a test in a course you might have really struggled with might bring up past experiences of failure, even past experiences of criticism for professors or even parents. And when that gets brought into the moment, it can be really hard to focus on the task at hand because not only are you going through this in your head, but it'll also just make you negatively react physically in your bodies as well. When people get really anxious, it sometimes makes them want to just abandon the task as a way to reduce their anxiety. And even though that might be like a helpful strategy in the moment, over time it can turn into a really unhealthy coping response, especially if the person keeps abandoning the task over time. And one thing I want to note is that achieving perfect standards or achieving really high standards doesn't always help people's anxiety. In fact, for some people, it makes it worse. And so, one thing I also like to mention is even students who do well can still experience significant anxiety around these tasks. And for them, it might not so much be about like they are prone to failing. For them, it might just be more that their anxiety is habitual. If you approach a situation with this kind of perspective, even when it feels like you can't help it, the more if you approach a situation with this kind of perspective repeatedly over time, sometimes it habituates and starts to become like this automatic reaction to homework. Next slide, please. So one thing I really like to go over is what happens to the brain when it's anxious. When we're under any kind of negative emotion, it actually affects our thinking style. And the main goal of why our brains go into this sort of really crude, basic thinking style is because It needs speed. It needs speed to make a quick decision so that we can survive the threat. Now, in the 21st century, we're not dealing with threats like animals attacking us or needing to find like shelter from a storm. Although that still does happen, but maybe not as often, um, we might experience more threats in terms of like social or academic. And so, what happens when you face these threats is that your brain is going to try and figure out the quickest way to handle this situation. And in order to do so, one of the first things it does is it takes mental shortcuts to figure out what's going on. It's going to try and organize information really quickly. Even if there's a lot of it, it's going to try and form as a story about it as quickly as possible. And that might involve leaving out key parts or key points of information. And then when it makes a decision, it's going to make a decision based on how it feels rather than what might be most rational. So next slide, please. A couple examples of how people's thinking gets affected by this. Psychologists and therapists and counselors often like to use cognitive distortions as a way to explain this. Cognitive distortions refer to patterns of thinking that can negatively affect how people see the world because they tend to be overly reductionistic and simplistic and don't take into account fully the nuances of the situation in front of them. So one kind of example of a cognitive distortion is jumping to conclusions. Some people do this where basically they just jump right to what they feel like is going to happen right away. Or another way it shows up is like people engage in fortune telling when they jump to conclusions, like they jump to conclusions about how the future is going to play out. Again, some of the examples that are most common is students will say, you know, I'm not only going to fail this exam or fail this project, but I'm going to fail this course. I'm going to fail college. I'm going to fail at life. And even though for the casual layperson who might be listening to them, they might think, well, I think you might be overly predicting what's going to happen. In the moment when people are really anxious, our brain actually has a hard time separating out what's rational or irrational when we're anxious. And so when we jump to conclusions and start to think, oh, I'm going to fail at life, I'm going to fail for the rest of time, in the moment, that can feel really real, especially when you add to the fact that anxiety makes people physically feel uncomfortable. It makes them physically feel like they're in danger in the moment. And so there's a tricky piece where, like, for some people, when they jump to conclusions and fortune tell, it can really feel like this is an established fact, that their predictions are really going to come true. Next slide, please. Another example of a cognitive distortion is personalization. This is when people really see themselves as the only cause for some unhealthy or negative external event that they were actually not responsible for, or only partially responsible for. So a common way I find this tends to show up is that a lot of anxious students are often concerned that their professors will personally dislike them, especially for struggling, asking questions. Even if they like had not shown up to class for several weeks, a lot of anxious students report like, you know, I'm pretty sure my professor is going to take it out on me. But one thing I want to reveal to you all behind the curtain about professors' reactions is that the majority of them are actually relieved when a student who hasn't been in touch with them reaches out, because it tells them, okay, now I can jump in and help this person. And it might take a lot of work on their part, but it at least lets them know where the student stands. And so one thing I really try to encourage students is try to ask for help no matter how far behind you are. And one thing that can come up too is that students will sometimes misperceive natural frustration as anger directed personally at them, when in fact, that frustration might just come from a place of it's hard to explain something in a lot of different ways when a person's not understanding. Or sometimes there's a natural frustration for the student not catching up on their work, but that doesn't mean that they think that you're an idiot or that they hate you. They just naturally feel frustrated more at the task at hand rather than at you as a person. And one other thing I'd like to note is that for people who tended to procrastinate more, they were more prone to using personalization and blaming like their academic difficulties on things they couldn't control, such as like, I just don't have the ability to do this, or I'm just lazy. And this can be really problematic when students use this and buy into it so much that it leads them to just give up on their homework. Next slide, please. So when people are in the middle of caught up in some of their anxious thinking, there are a couple strategies that can be helpful. The first one is any kind of constructive thinking, which basically involves any ways in which people can counter their negative thinking. And so a couple questions that can help guide you through this can be, what is my evidence for and against my thinking? Are my thoughts actually factual, or are they just my interpretations or opinions about the situation? Are there any other ways that I could look at this situation? Is this situation as bad as I'm making it out to be, or does it just feel like it will be bad? Is thinking this way helping me to feel good or to achieve my goals? Or what can I do that will help me solve the problem? For some people, they find distraction as a better strategy. And so what that means is that they might find like when they sit down to do something, they might have to turn on calming music as a way to add one extra layer of something that they can focus on rather than get lost in their own thoughts. For some people, this is where group studying can be helpful. It's helpful to be around other motivated people, and you might find like that can help you really focus on the task at hand rather than getting lost in your thoughts. Next slide, please. Other ways to manage anxious thinking is to think like, what is going to focus on the task and what's going to focus on my anxiety. And so for some people, they really have to separate, wait, what is the problem I actually have to deal with? And what is the problem my anxiety is trying to create? Because, for example, you might have to sit down and study for an exam, and you might get anxious about failing the course or failing even the semester. And for some students, that's way too far ahead. There's not enough evidence to indicate that's going to happen. But when people are really anxious, they really do believe that's going to happen. And so sometimes people have to pause and ask themselves, wait a minute, what is the actual thing I have to deal with? And what is the issue or the problem my anxiety is just trying to make up in this moment? And people have to separate, what do I have to do now? And what's a problem to deal with later? For some people, they really have to use this as an opportunity to accept and cope with setbacks. Even if they're failing, it can be incredibly helpful for a student to ask themselves when they're ready to do this, what do I stand to learn from this situation? For some students, anxious thinking is a way to like control ambiguity, to control gray areas, to control like when the future is really unclear. Sometimes our anxious brains just make up an answer as a way to control for the fact that we can't handle the idea that we can't predict the future. And so for some students, they really have to actually make room for a lot more ambiguity in their lives, where they have to note like, you know what, the answer isn't clear, and that's okay for now. I will find out that answer over time. And I just have to accept that and move on to something else. The other thing that a student can do is they can focus on how procrastination will lead to fewer positive outcomes rather than more negative outcomes. So another way to put this is, I think it's helpful for students to recognize either what they stand to gain by not procrastinating. And this could be, oh, next slide, please. You could think about, for example, you're stressed now and it makes it hard to do work, but starting now will also reduce your future stress levels. You may feel anxious now, but that will decrease over time if you get started and stick with your work, even for 15 to 20 minutes. You increase your chances at doing better or understanding the material more if you start now. You increase your chances at identifying problems now rather than later. You will be more focused and even present with your friends if you start this work now and have a sense of either how to do it or get it done. And even if you're failing or like really behind or haven't been in class for weeks, You might be procrastinating with other behaviors that could be helpful, like talking to a professor, an advisor, reaching out to the Center for Student Success, the Career Center, Mental Health Services, Anti-Violence Initiative Office, Alcohol and Drug Education Programming. You might have to tell yourself, you know what? If I get help now, I can deal with the bigger issue at hand that's affecting my academics. Next slide, please. Another way to actually cope with anxious thinking is to actually journal. Research indicates that journaling about anxieties prior to an exam was actually helpful in reducing anxiety for some thoughts. And the main reason why is because it just helped them get out everything that they were thinking about and putting it down on paper. It's an alternative method to getting out your thoughts. It allows you to fully outline everything you're thinking. And this is important because when our brains are trying to attend to something, it can only attend to so many things at once. And when we're anxious, so many thoughts go through our minds. And so I really encourage students journal out your thoughts and write them out fully, because if you don't, you might find yourself just spinning around the same topics and on the topics that cause you the most anxiety. So one way to do this is just free write for 5 minutes about anything and everything that runs through your head, as well as write it out fully. And for people who struggle with journaling and don't know what to write in the beginning, I recommend start there. Even a sentence with, I don't know what to write, I've never done this before, this is really weird, can sometimes really grease the wheels and get people journaling. Next slide, please. Anxiety does not only affect our thoughts, it affects our bodies, and we can have a number of different physical symptoms come up that make it really difficult to not only focus, but these are the symptoms that often come up that tell us when we're in danger. And this is also a big problem that I mentioned with anxiety, which is when it helps us identify potential threat in the future, it makes us feel like that threat is happening right now. Our physical symptoms do not have a sense of time. It does not tell us, oh, this pain is for the future. It's actually just pain that or stress that's happening to us right now. And so sometimes when people have anxious thoughts about the future, when their physical symptoms really act up, that's what makes them feel like, oh, this is really imminent, or this is a problem that's happening for me right now. Next slide, please. And so we're going to go over a technique. And before we even do deep breathing, I wanted to mention this one aspect, which is for some people, in order to challenge their thinking or have a rational perspective, they might find they need to actually calm themselves down physically before they start challenging their thoughts. And the reason why I say this is because I had a lot of students report, I can think about a situation rationally when I feel more calmly, but in the moment I can't. And if you identify with that statement, that's a good sign that you might want to do some calming activities before you start to challenge some of your thinking. And one of them can be deep breathing. So I'm going to actually do an exercise with everyone called square breathing. We'll do a practice round of it, or actually 3 practice rounds of it. And I'll outline the instructions, which go like this. I'm going to have everyone inhale for 4 counts, hold your breath for 4 counts, exhale for 5 counts, and then hold your breath for 4 counts. If 4 counts is too long, shorten it. If 4 counts is too short, lengthen it. We'll do 3 rounds of this. I'll read out the instructions. And one thing I often like to note to people is you might find it's hard to do this technique the first couple times, but usually by the 3rd time, people get it. If you notice a reduction in any kind of anxiety symptom, that's a good sign. Even if it's a tiny reduction, that's a good sign because it tells me your body's responding to it. So I'm going to ask everyone to find a comfortable seated position. And you can do this eyes open, eyes closed. And then inhale, 2, 3, 4, holds, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold, 2, 3, 4. Last one, inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold, 2, 3, 4. So some people might feel a little lightheaded after doing that. That's not necessarily a bad sign. And what I would say is that sometimes comes up with deep breathing. If you feel like it passes away, even just after a few seconds, then it's probably a good sign. And I encourage people to generally not use it if they find they really struggle with like control. Some students find like they need so much control in their lives that even just relaxing their breath feels dangerous because it feels like they're losing control. So I encourage students to practice that at least once a day. And if you even notice any reduction, that's a good sign. I also like to let them know deep breathing doesn't always work, especially in really heightened moments of anxiety, but I encourage students to do it anyways, because even if you notice the smallest change, that's a good sign that you're affecting your anxiety in a positive way. Next slide, please. So one thing I like to mention about studying as a group that can be helpful for anxiety, especially if group members are able to offer support, encouragement, acknowledge like it's difficult, but still encourage the person to get help or keep pushing through. If the group members can keep each other on track and enjoy a good break together. I find studying as a group is not helpful for anxiety when people use it as a way to distract each other excessively, or if they need like constant reassurance from the group members to the point where it actually distracts other group members. I find that if people use study groups as a way to just avoid the task at hand can be a problem. Or if they use their peers as a negative comparison, like, oh, they're so much smarter than me, I'm just so stupid, like that can sometimes really lead people to have difficulty studying in a group. Next slide, please. Ultimately, chronic procrastination can really worsen mental health over time, especially anxiety. What we tend to find is like when people procrastinate and push off their work, it makes them more doubtful of themselves. It lowers their self-esteem. They start to feel more insecure. The sheer difficulty of catching up can make them feel less motivated, more sad. And when you're sad and anxious, it's hard to be like in a good mood around your friends. And you might find things that typically wouldn't bother you do all of a sudden, and that's where irritability comes into play. You might find it's harder to concentrate because you're so focused on like all the threats around you. You might even have difficulty sleeping because you can't stop thinking about it. Next slide, please. And I want to make a special note about trauma and how it affects anxiety and procrastination. You know, for some people, their anxiety around academics can be influenced by past traumatic experiences. For example, a traumatic relationship can really affect people's trust and the degree to that they've and the degree to which they feel like they can seek help from other people. They might even, as a result of that trauma, experience a heightened sense of danger from other people or fear that they're unable to handle a professor's like anger and disappointment, because for them, they might experience that as like either really threatening, or they're really worried that like the professor's going to express it in a really toxic and unhealthy way, such as like blaming the student for like their intelligence or making it about their character. For some students, the solution is to seek help from other people, and this becomes really a big problem for some students who are trying to deal with like trauma in their backgrounds, because seeking help from a professor can involve a lot of vulnerability, meaning like you have to tell them why you're struggling and why you might need help. And that can be really intimidating for some students. And if you had a lot of traumatic experiences in your life, you might be really anxious about trying to trust someone in that manner. And sometimes those experiences just pile on top of your anxiety and make it even harder to reach out to a professor. And so for some students, they avoid as a way to protect themselves. Next slide, please. So, you know, anxiety is pretty normal for academics. You know, I think it's fair to say like We feel threatened at times by the grades we need to achieve or the work that we have to do. And it can be easy to like think about how that might play out in the future. But I get really concerned when students report feeling hopeless or worthless throughout the day, over multiple days, even weeks at some points. I get worried when students just report like constantly having a negative or difficult mood that gets in their work entirely. I get concerned when students report having struggles in multiple areas of their life, not just in academics, when it's with friends, family, their health, their work. I get worried when students have missed class for several weeks or have multiple class absences in multiple courses due to low motivation and or fear, anxiety, or sadness. And if a student is talking about suicide or even giving nonverbal messages of suicide, like they're giving away their possessions, they're saying it doesn't matter anymore, or they're just like not showing up to class at all and saying, you know, it doesn't really matter and it's not a big deal. I figured it out, but they don't have a clear plan about how they're going to move forward. That could be a big sign that the student is in crisis. And I always recommend reaching out to MHS 911 or the dean of students, or if you're not ready for that, even just reaching out to a supervisor and starting there can help you guide you to where you need to go next. Next slide, please. And speaking of, if this presentation made you think, you know, I might want to consider a group or individual services at MHS, this is how you can go about doing it. Other resources to consider if you're not ready for MHS. You might want to consider our anxiety management workshop. That's a drop-in workshop where for 4 sessions, people can learn additional skills to address their anxiety. You might want to talk to a supportive other, whether that's a CA, advisor, professor, a coach, or a supervisor. You know, if you're really worried about a friend who seems to be really struggling with their mental health, you can file a CARES report in the TCNJ care system, and that'll be an anonymous report sent to the dean of students, who will then reach out that student to connect them to help. And so there are a lot of different ways you can approach this. And I think that's actually my presentation. Those are my references. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to add them in the chat box. Oh, and we're actually done. Thank you. Oh, Maddie, you're unmuted or muted. I'm sorry.
I sure am muted. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for my somewhat delayed queuing, but thank you for queuing that verbally. That made it a lot easier for me. I have a few things just to go over just from my area, Center for Student Success, and it really ties closely to what Jonathan was saying. I have not been monitoring the chat as closely because I wasn't able to with my screen being shared, but I did just want to say I was so happy that Dr. Murakami brought up the fact that, you know, a situation, if you logged in late, I'm having some difficulty allowing Dr. Murakami to be a panelist. And so we ended up having to kind of back end this in a silly way where I was sharing the screen and he talked over me. But it was anxiety inducing. All of a sudden, this workshop that I'm running is not going the way I planned it. And for a minute there, I was kind of thinking, I don't know what to do. And so I was really grateful that Dr. Murakami came up with that idea. And then on the other end, my colleague, Ms. Morano, is attending as well. And so I was able to message her and ask her to submit things through the chat. So it worked really well for me to ask for help and find a solution with others. Otherwise, I don't think I would have come up with something so quickly. So that was a good example of how things might go off track a little bit, but you know, reaching out and having your support around you help you can make sure that you actually can succeed anyway. So I'm going to share my screen again and get my slides up. So we just talked about some of the more clinical types of things with procrastination, anxiety, mental health. And I'm just going to talk about some things that you as students can do to set yourself up for success throughout the semester. We are a little further into the semester now. So there's still things that you can do that can help with lowering your anxiety, lowering that feeling of that you have to scramble, that you're behind. So there's some things that you can do to really set yourself up. The first is setting realistic goals. So you want to set realistic goals for your day. I'm the type of person where if I have a huge to-do list, naturally I'm like, I'm going to knock it all out because I know I will be anxious until every single thing is off that list, but that's really not realistic all the time. Being really realistic means knowing you, knowing yourself, how much time you take to do things, and also giving yourself breaks. So, no marathon study sessions. Balance it with other activities, meaning that you don't just say, okay, today is my only work study day. I'm not leaving my room until I finish all of my work. That's not a healthy way to do things. You want to balance it with other activities. Give yourself a little time to exercise. Make sure you take a break. Make sure you do something you enjoy. And that way, that when you come back to your work, you're able to focus on it. Also, learn to say no. This makes me kind of an unpopular person sometimes when students meet with me, because a lot of TCNJ students take on a lot. That is one of the best things about TCNJ students. You're so engaged, you have a lot of stuff going on in your life. That's fabulous. However, sometimes your plate gets too full, and you're not really setting yourself up to do great in every area if you have too many areas to spread yourself around. So, learning to say no, learning to prioritize is a skill. It's not something that just happens, it takes practice. So, trying to say no, it makes me unpopular because sometimes students say, how do I fit all this in? And I say, you can't. That's not always what students want to hear. But sometimes you have to start saying no to things so that you can prioritize other things. Something I talk to students about all the time is, when setting those realistic goals, is taking a large project and breaking it into small pieces so that you can really tackle it. That makes it more realistic that you'll actually sit down and work for a set amount of time. And it allows you to feel more accomplished at the end. You actually can succeed if you have taken something small, taken a chunk of it, and worked on it for an hour. You can actually finish a piece of it rather than trying to do it all at once. So that way you set yourself up by setting a realistic goal for that day. Another thing to do is set yourself up by having an environment that's conducive for working. So we talked about distractions a little bit, but I keep saying this, but be realistic with yourself. Know yourself and be honest with yourself. You may want to be the kind of person who can work around other people because you like being around other people, but maybe that's not the best place to actually do your work. So think about what kind of person you are and really be honest about what you want to be like and what you are like, because that makes a big difference. You want to eliminate distractions. A lot of students ask me, how can I focus more? I don't feel very focused. We have distractions everywhere. I have 4 screens in front of me right now. I have noises going on around me. So think about ways that you can eliminate distractions in a realistic way. Maybe that means putting your phone away. Maybe it means having a set of headphones that you have ambient noise or some kind of really soothing music. Maybe you cannot hear anything, so you need to mute everything around you. That's where it takes some self-knowledge and some honesty with what you need in order to succeed. I always say don't get too comfy too. I have a lot of students who do their work on their beds, especially when they live on campus. This happened to me last night, actually. I was doing some reading for my class and I was all cozy on the couch. I had my dog next to me, I had my blankie, and I was so cozy. You know, I fell asleep within 10 minutes. That's not the best way to actually do work. That was okay because I didn't have big goals for myself. I was okay with falling asleep. But if you have some work to accomplish and you need to get through something, don't let yourself get too comfortable. Sit somewhere where you can really focus. You're not going to get too squishy and comfy so that you get sleepy and want to start doing other things. You want to sit somewhere where you can have the ability to actually do work and not get distracted or too comfy. And so this always kind of comes back. Self-care is kind of a buzzwordy thing now. And I know that it's something that we talk about, self-care, I put it on Instagram, but it really is important, because especially if you are somebody who is prone to get anxious or is prone to feeling big feelings, as I say to myself sometimes, you want to make sure that you are filling your tank along the way so that if you come up to an obstacle, you have something in reserve in order to face that obstacle. So you have to think about ways to pay yourself first. When we talk about saving money, we talk about paying yourself before you pay the bills. And I think of the same thing with self-care. When it comes to where you spend your energy, when it comes to confronting obstacles, if you've been paying yourself first, if you've been taking care of yourself, if you've been filling your cup, when you come up against something, you're able to actually face it because you've been putting that time into yourself. So number one is sleep. Mr. Johnson is the biggest sleep person I know. He's always talking about get sleep, and he's right. You need sleep. Sleep is good for your body. You need to eat, nourish yourself. And I don't just mean grab whatever's around you, plan your meals. When I talk to students about time management and we go through a time management grid, we look at Google, first thing I have them do is like, okay, when you eat lunch, what time are you going to bed? Because if you put those on your schedule first, you'll actually do them. Move your body. We're behind screens all the time. I sit for 8 hours a day. So you have to do something to move your body a little bit. Go outside if it's good weather, even if it's just walking around your house, even if it's just taking, a second to stretch, gaze into the distance, give your eyes a break. You need to move your body a little bit. And then I say something you enjoy in your day. That is where it will vary, really. Your enjoyment is it's what you like. So I don't know, maybe give yourself a very set amount of time for TikTok. I'm not saying go down a TikTok hole. Those are meant to be addictive. Maybe give yourself a 5-minute TikTok break, 5 minutes. Maybe it is going outside, and I had my students build snowmen. Maybe it's just doing something silly, but do something that you enjoy that you can give yourself as a reward throughout your day. Screen-free time, no matter what that is. Maybe go cook, do something fun. And then finally, I say talk. I think right now, it doesn't have to be talking to a specific person, but right now it's really easy to be isolated. We are on our computers a lot. We are talking to people virtually. Sometimes we're attending a webinar like this and you actually don't interact. You just watch something. So something that helps me is just talking, just having somebody to talk to, even if it's not about something deep like my feelings, even if it's just talking to my mom about America's Next Top Model, which I do every night. So getting a little bit of interaction can really help you not feel isolated. And for me, it really fills my cup. So what happens if you fall behind? I was so glad that Dr. Murakami said this before, but asking for help from your professors, no matter how behind you are, is so key. I also teach on campus, and I tell my students all the time, I need to hear from you if you are struggling at all. It's really hard for me to help you if I have no idea what's going on. The earlier you can go to somebody and ask for help, the easier it is to solve the problem, but it's never too late to reach out for help. Your faculty want to help you. If you're behind, there are ways to catch up and there is help available to you, but you need to go out of your way to do that. So your professors are a way to get help. You can email them. You can go to their office hours. You can come to an advisor at my office, Center for Student Success. That's what CSS is. We have a contact us page. You can just message any of us and we're happy to help talk to you about how to catch up. Mental health services is there to help if you are feeling overwhelmed or some anxiety about it. And then also ask your classmates for help. Maybe they could help you catch up on some notes that you missed or come up with a study plan. But it always comes back to come up with a manageable and realistic plan. And if you don't know how to do that, that's why we are there to help you. All the while, though, you have to keep taking care of yourself. A lot of students will get into a focused set where I have to catch up. I don't care if I miss sleep. I don't care if I don't eat. It's not worth it if you're hurting yourself in the process. So yes, catch up, but take care of yourself along the way. And then what if you struggle with anxiety? Again, ask for help. And I say use these in tandem because these resources are here for you, but it's not just one or the other. You can go to all of these things. You have resources that can be used together, and we all work together to help you. We're a network. So professors, again, my office, mental health services, or accessibility resource center, we're all here. Again, manageable and realistic goals, and make sure you incorporate your stress relievers along the way. So maybe you have set yourself a goal for 1 hour of reading a research paper, and because you have a response due, give yourself a 15-minute walk break afterwards, or give yourself a journaling break afterwards, something that you know will help you to de-stress. And then finally, practice forgiveness and patience with yourself and talk to yourself as you would a dear friend. Often self talk is really different than what you would say to somebody else. So even if it feels fake, even if it doesn't feel natural, start talking to yourself and tell yourself things that you would tell somebody else if they were going through something. Like if I mess up a webinar, I would tell myself, this happens to everybody. Technical malfunctions are kind of a thing now because we live in a digital age. Don't beat yourself up. Nobody cares. Even if I feel like I care a lot, talking to yourself through it can help you bring down some of that anxiety. And then remember, you're not alone. It's really common to feel like you are the only person going through something because, especially now, if you're home or if you're in a dorm room, you might feel really isolated. So you assume you're the only one feeling that, and you're not. You're not the only one feeling that. And we have a lot of help for you, and we want to help you. So, my key takeaways, remember, you're not the only one struggling, and you can get help. We want to help you. And there is no threshold of pain or struggle or trauma that you need to meet before you reach out for help. I think a lot of times we're like, it could be a lot worse. I might need some help, but I'm just going to keep trying until I do it. Or other people need help more than me. There's no baseline. If you feel like maybe you need some help, just reach out and we can help you where you are. This is our websites, MHS and CSS here. So if you want to write those down, those are our websites. That is all I have for you. Mine was just a quick overview. The meat of this was in Dr. Murakami's presentation, but I do want to give a chance to have you answer any questions. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat or you can raise your hand and I will call on you. And thank you so much for coming. I will put a feedback form in the chat as well. I'll wait to see if anyone has questions.